seems to me naturals have the potential to be some of the worst coffees in the world, but also some of the best coffees in the world, all depending on how you as the producer control it and handle it. So you have the producer or the coffee processor has an extreme amount of power to ultimately make this coffee really amazing or really insignificant. So all of these play into the big picture of natural coffees. The production, the raw material, the cherry, the genetics, environmental factors, farming practices, harvesting practices. I think we talked yesterday, harvesting practices are one of the hardest areas of farming / processing to bring in change. It's one of the most difficult things because you're working with culture, you're working with people. It's a very expensive part of your labor, but it also has one of the highest impacts on the quality of coffee. So primary process, what happens when a natural dries, the fermentation that's taking place in the coffee cherry, the physical changes that are happening as it's drying. Also, how it's roasted is different. Roasting naturals is different. And the final product, naturals are a very different product that has a specific market that people want. There's certain markets that want naturals, other markets don't want naturals. The specialty coffee market wants naturals. They desire naturals. The third wave coffee market, these are the guys running the small coffee shops, doing the pour-overs, doing the slow brew. These kind of guys all want natural because the natural has the potential to bring out a lot more unique flavors. We saw the demucelizer operating this morning. When you pulp your coffee mechanically, then demucelize it mechanically, all within the same day, the sugars that are attached to that bean are completely removed within a short period of time. And it's those sugars that get eaten up in fermentation and affect the flavor. So if you're doing a full wash mechanical demucilization, you are taking away any opportunity for fermentation to impact the flavor of the coffee. Can the flavor of the coffee be good? Yes, it can be. If it's a nice coffee grown at a high altitude, a nice variety, it can be really good. But you're taking away the potential for some more bold, unique flavors to develop. There is an opportunity within the international market right now to produce naturals and at a higher value and make more money off of it. If you can figure out within your local setup how to do it and how to control it in a way, yes, there is great potential to produce. And obviously, like anything that happens developmentally, it has to grow. You shouldn't expect farmers to just all of a sudden go from their whole lives doing wash coffee to everything doing it natural. Starting with small batches and kind of getting the hang of it and learning how to control the parameters. We're going to talk about what those parameters are just
now.
They're
risky there.
Yeah. But yeah, there's great opportunity. And the market right now in this time within the coffee industry, the market really wants it and desires it. These slides are really small, but it's basically saying what we just said, that they're more heavy bodied, they're more sweet, subdued acidities, which you want in an espresso blend. You want to have a natural in it with a subdued heavy body, subdued acidity, can help mellow out your espresso blend. And be a big part of blending. There's always a downside that you're going to have fermented beans. You're more likely to have full black beans, full sour beans. So this slide is talking about germination. Some people say that naturals is all about germination. Fructose and glucose produce acid, and that acid produces fruity flavors. So the metabolism on the fruit is active when when in a natural. The sugars are there, and that metabolism is happening, and these sugars are producing the acids, which are giving you the unique flavors. This does not happen in a wash process, and it happens slightly in a honey process. This is what's happening. Fermentation. Yeast eats the sugar and produces ethanol. Ethanol bonds with the fatty acids and produces esters. This is called the esterification process. This is producing tannins and flavor notes that are unique to the natural process. This is very similar to what happens in winemaking. Esterification process is what gives it its bold flavors that are similar to what happens in wine when wine is being fermented. What gives it its unique, bold flavors. There are bold, if you drink grape juice and then compare it to drinking wine, there are flavors in wine that aren't present in grape juice. And that's very similar to coffee in that when you drink a wash process, you're going to get a much cleaner, sweeter, well, not sweeter so much, brighter cup. But if you have a natural process, there's going to be more bold flavors. And it's going to be very difficult to do a natural unless you're doing like a machine dried natural or mechanically dried natural. You have some kind of like hot air machine or something.
What about
if you're doing small batches, it's very easy to do. If you're doing this on a large scale, being able to control the fermentation while you deliver it from the farm down to the drying area, because the second you pick that cherry and you place it in the bag, it's fermenting. And the longer you keep it in that bag, your fermentation is going, and you could lose control of the fermentation. If you've got control of your fermentation, like if you've got it out drying and you know the rate at which it's drying, you can control that. But if it's in a bag on the back of a truck driving down a mountain, you can't control that.
ideally within a day?
Oh yeah, with ASAP, as soon as possible. These guys that pick early in the morning, but it only gets delivered late at night to the processing center, I think that's even a bit too long, but it does happen. Bacteria plays a very important role in the first couple of days. We're going to have a graph just now. I'm going to show you this, but bacteria helps break down the mucilage and produces acetic acid. Yeasts are important in the middle of the process. Middle of the drying process is when yeasts are most likely to grow, provide beneficial flavors, and then fungi or mold is what happens at the end of the process and during storage, which is never ever beneficial. So just to go through those again, you have, when you're drying the coffee, the opportunity for 3 different things to grow. Bacteria can grow. It can be very beneficial, but also has potential to add a lot of bad flavors, and if there's too much of it, it can contaminate your coffee. There's yeast. Yeast always produces amazing, bold flavors. Yeast is a good thing. It's never a bad thing. And then there's mold, and that's always a bad thing, unless you really like that type of flavor. Some varieties deliver a better flavor when used as naturals. Actually, this chart here is a processing flavor matrix. This was all taken from Catamore. So this tells you we took Catamore variety from one particular farm, and then we processed it many different ways. We cupped it, and these are the cupping notes that we got. So you'll see that it branches off in the middle is the cherry, and then it branches off into different types of processing. So the natural process is the one directly to the left. That got apricot, blackberry, apple, blueberry. There's many of those different, more boldy, fruity type flavors. Whereas the wash process directly to the right got walnut, butter, peanut, black currant, dates, raisins. So this is an example of how the process can give completely different flavors to the same exact coffee. Some specific flavor notes also from other coffees that have been tested throughout the world, but very common for naturals and even pulp naturals would be lots of tropical fruits like passion fruit, mango, pineapple, banana, guava, lots of berries, strawberries, cherry, blueberry, blackberry, wine, grape, cranberry, caramels like molasses and sugar cane and brown sugar, then dried fruits like prune, dates, tamarind, pumpkin, raisin, dried figs, spices like cinnamon, chili pepper, aniseed, cardamom, oregano, but some taints like blue cheese, Roquefort cheese, cognac, things like that. So if you understand what's happening to the coffee cherry when it's fermenting, when the sugars are turning into alcohol and attaching with the fatty acids, these flavors are being created. You have all sorts of potential, but if you let it get out of control, then it can be really bad. So we have a diagram here where we had 10 kgs of cherries. And so on this side, we put 10 kg, 5 kg, that's 0 kg, and then in between 2.5, 7.5. And then on the bottom, we had moisture content. And so at different stages, when we measured it and we got this percentage, this weight with this percentage moisture. So as it dries, the weight is getting less and the moisture is getting less. That's why I was saying that we can measure those cherries I put out was 5 kgs. This morning it was 4.72. At lunchtime it was 4.46. As the weight drops, so will the moisture content, and we can track what the actual moisture content is more or less by the weight, okay? But what we did is at each one of these points, we tested for what is living, what is actually going on. And we found that somewhere in this area here, bacteria is growing. If these are naturals, going down to 0%, it would be around 20 days, roughly 20 days. What's important to note here is that in the beginning of the drying process, when the moisture content is high, there is great opportunity for bacteria to grow. In the middle of the process is premium opportunity for yeast to grow. And at the end of the process is when mold grows. This is the important thing. You need to understand, if you are working with coffee and you're letting it sit in a bag all day too long before actually getting it to the drying facility, you're subjecting your coffee to bacteria, which there are thousands of potential bacteria, hundreds of thousands of potential bacteria growing in our world today. A handful of them can be beneficial, can give beneficial characteristics to the coffee, help with the flavor. The rest of them can give really bad flavors. Yeah, that's when you would use the scale. You would, let's say you're drying a whole bed of naturals. You could, at the end of the bed, keep a section separate. Just gather up enough to be like 5 or 10 kgs and dry that separately, and you can keep weighing that. So what started at 10 kgs, when it gets down to 5 kgs, you'll know it's lost 50% of its moisture. That's how you know. But you have to keep those specific cherries separate. So the actual protocols that we were given when we did the processing class were not 85. It was when the cherries had reached 50% of their original is when we did the yeast fermentation. Thomas and I attended a class last year where we had to basically promote yeast growth, and so we let them dry a little bit until they got to 50% of their weight. Then we put them in a bag for 5 days or less, depending, and let the yeast grow because the yeast is always good. And then we took them out. If you let them go too long in the bag, then the mold starts to kick in. Yes, you want to get past this bacteria stage as quick as possible, and you don't want to stall out. That's what happened. We had some naturals we were doing last year, and we got to around 20 days, and then the sun just stopped shining at the end of the harvest season. And then they stalled, and they got stuck, and then they got moldy. It could be. I'm saying there's a lot of potential there. So when the yeast is growing and when you are smelling your cherries, they're going to smell very sweet and almost like grape jelly, like jelly. And if ever at one stage you smell them and they don't smell nice, they smell bitter or foul, then you've gone too far. So this is something that has to be done with a lot of care, and it's not something for a beginner to do. This is what a professional coffee producer who's had years of experience and he's on the fringe of the new things within coffee, this is what they're doing. You shouldn't put, if you bag it for yeast to grow, you shouldn't leave it in the sun. It will cook it. Yeah. It should go in under a roof, and it should be evaluated like 2 or 3 times a day just to make sure it's not going rancid. Well, just to say again, there is some potentially good flavors that are developed through bacteria, but it's like Russian roulette. This area here, you could one time have a coffee that gets stuck in this area of dryness and develop really good flavors, and then the next time it's just really inconsistent. You can't reproduce it time after time after time. Yeast, there's only bacteria, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of strains in the world. Yeast, there's only a handful compared to that. There's a very small amount of yeast, and they are known, all of them, for producing good flavors. That's why it's used so much in cooking and baking, and it produces good flavors. Now, if you understand this concept of what is happening at different stages of the drying process, then you can control yeast however you want to, whether it's in a bag or in a box or outside of the sun. It just depends on your environment and what you have at your disposal. Yes, yeah. I mean, that's what's happening when guys add sugarcane or champagne yeast, things like that. Yeah. The thing is, at this moment, there is no scientific data that says adding a foreign yeast will drastically impact the flavor of that particular coffee.
We did wine yeast last year.
Yeah.
It doesn't really affect anything.
But this yeast is endogenous to the coffee cherry, and this stage of the drying process in the middle is when it's active. And we know that when it's active, that is when your biggest flavor development, positive flavor development, is happening. That's when you're getting the bolder. The yeast are eating the carbohydrates, the sugars, and it's the esterification process, right? That's happening now when the yeast is active. Yeast, as well as bacteria and mold, are all sensitive to temperature and moisture. So different types of yeast like different temperatures. Like beer yeast, that these big brewing companies are yeast that have been developed over hundreds of years to have a higher tolerance to hotter temperatures. But like bread yeast is like super intolerant to hot temperatures. So it will die if you use bread yeast to make like alcohol. the bread yeast will actually die very quickly as soon as it heats up, and as soon as the alcohol rate rises as well. It's also yeast has a tolerance to alcohol as well. So the more alcohol that's produced, the yeast are actually the ones making it, but at some point there's so much alcohol that it kills the yeast. So this is a basic brewing principle, whether it's in alcohol making, bread making, things like this. All types of yeast have different conditions that are perfect for their growth. What we found in coffee is that the yeast that's endogenous to coffee grows really well in this middle stage. And if you can figure out a way when you're drying to slow it down or put the emphasis on this type, make sure you get quickly through bacteria, go quickly through the mold, then there's potential to develop a lot of really cool flavors, because it's yeast that develops the really bold, strong flavors of natural. This is not something that's critical to have a good natural. It's not something that you have to do to produce a natural, but it is a tool that is available to people that are trying to create these amazing new high quality naturals. Yes. Yeah. And any kind of drying, whether it's happening in drying parchment or drying naturals, that should happen in the nighttime. When the coffee gets wrapped up in plastic or placed in bags for storage in the night, there should be this sharing process where moist cherries are sharing their moisture with dry cherries, and they're all homogenizing throughout the bag. That is the very simple way of looking at it. Naturals, it depends if there's enough sunlight or not, but my basic schedule would be to put it out in the sun every day for up to 20 days. Yeah, and bag it up or wrap it up at night. I've never developed anything more complex than that. I think with naturals, we have bagged it up like after 3 to 5 days. We have bagged it up for a couple of days in order to promote yeast growth, but we did it very cautiously. We kept it inside in a bag, and we were constantly smelling it to make sure that it wasn't going to go moldy. So, but with naturals, I think you got to, especially in this region of Southeast Asia, you got to be really careful, because you could lose your sun at any moment. And if you lose your sun, then you lose unless you have a machine dryer, you lose your opportunity, and you could lose that whole batch of coffee if you're not careful. Being on top of it's like anything that's with quality control, being on top of the situation and not reacting to it. So like getting the cherries from the farm to the drying facility, making sure there's a plan ahead of time of when that's going to happen, how it's going to happen, who's driving it. And what happens in a lot of third world nations or developing nations, rural farming areas, is that there's always something that happens. You know, there's always a breakdown, or there's just having a plan to make sure that it doesn't get stuck in the bag between the field for too long, because it's really susceptible to bacteria at that stage. And if you want to try it, if you want to experiment with it, doing like keeping it in the bag overnight and only processing the next morning, it's a great thing to, if you control it and you're able to replicate. Can you replicate it is the question. If you're just doing something that can't be replicated just because you lost control and people are running around and not doing what they're supposed to do, then that's not worth doing. But if you can give very controllable parameters that you can replicate again the next day or the next week, and say, okay, this coffee, we're going to harvest it. It's harvested today. We're going to deliver it to the processing facility, but we're actually going to leave it in the bag tied up until tomorrow morning at 8 when we start processing. Then you do that, you dry it, you taste it, evaluate it. Was there anything unique about it, beneficial about it? Then if there was, you try it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. But the honest truth is, in every different place in the world, there's a new potential for what could work and what could not work. All of this flavor matrix that I showed you with all the different flavors from the Cadamore, we did that in Yunnan province, and without a doubt, the natural process was the best coffee of all the coffees. We did the same exact thing with Cadamore at Doi Chong, and the honey process was by far way better than the natural process. Same variety of coffee, same experiment, but we got different results because the location, the climate, the things like this impact it. So you can test all these different processes in different locations, and you may get different results. And what you need to be able to do, if you're working with farmers, if you're producing coffee yourself, you need to be able to go into each one of these places, perform each one of these experiments under highly controlled environments. In other words, you write down that this one's going to be washed, this one's going to have a 12-hour fermentation, the next one's going to have a 24-hour fermentation, this one's going to be a natural. You need to be able to follow that with precision, and then you cup it and you see what you get. Who knows what the possibilities are in every location. You can wrap it up, you can put it indoors, you can put it in a big fermentation tank, you can put it in bags, you can put it in Grain Pro. The principle's the same. Can you slow it down? Now, if you try to slow it down, but you can't control your temperature and you leave it out in the sun wrapped up in plastic, you're gonna cook it and it's gonna go rotten. But if you can slow this down by trapping the humidity, trapping the moisture, and keeping the temperature low, then you can develop these yeasts. You don't want it to rain on your coffee. You want it. If you're trying to slow it down and promote yeast growth, you want to trap the humidity that's there to slow down the drying process. But you do not want to add more moisture, because then you're going back up, and you're going to get bacteria. Your embryo thinks that it's supposed to come alive and form a tree, and it's going to eat up all the sugars and kill your seed. So keeping a constant, whether it's like this or like this or like this, you want to keep that constant so that the seed knows it's not supposed to become a tree. If you start doing this, you're confusing the embryo of that seed, and you're making that thing think that it's got a future, of which it does not have. From what I understand, yeast is more region specific, not so much seasonal specific as much as it is regionally. Yeast that you find in coffee, which is endogenous to coffee or grows within coffee, in this area may be different than yeast growing in coffee in South America. So this is a graph that says it measured the amount of bacteria in different types of drying places with coffee. So the first place was coffee drying outdoors on a mesh raised table like an African bed, a thin layer of coffee frequently turned. This had the least amount of bacteria growing. The second treatment was outdoors, mesh raised table, but a thick layer of coffee, and turned only sporadically, not very regularly. It had a medium amount of bacteria. And then the last treatment was a honeyed process in a bucket, outdoors for 2 days. And then on the third day, it was spread onto a mesh raised table in a thin layer with frequent turning. And that had an unbelievable amount of bacteria growing. So what happened was, because the last one they kept in a bucket for 2 days, they paused the drying process somewhere in here. And the amount of bacteria that was growing on it was leaps and bounds more than the other coffee. So when coffee gets left or forgotten about in a bag, in a bucket, or left outside, it has a huge, we think of it as small, we think of it as like oh, we're just trying, it's like corn, you know? You think of corn, well, you just got to get corn to the right moisture rate so that it doesn't go mold when you store it. But this actually impacts the flavor drastically. A lot of people say that the yellow varieties produce some of the best naturals. They believe that they're juicier, higher sugar content, and they produce really, really nice natural coffee. So one way you can affect the coffee, natural coffees, affect how quickly it dries, and you may not even think about this, is when you lay it out on the bed, being intentional about how thick. So if you have a thick layer of coffee, you're gonna slow down the processing, or slow down the drying of your coffee, sorry. If you have a thin layer, your coffee's gonna dry faster. If you don't have a lot of sunlight and you need to dry your coffee as fast as possible, you need to make sure that your coffee is laid out nice and thin. If you stack it too thick, it's not gonna dry quick enough. If you have lots of sun to work with and you wanna play around more with yeast growth, things like that, then you can make it thicker and slow down how quick it dries. The slower the drying process, the flavors go from chocolatey, berry-like, winey, sour, to moldy. So to put this another way, a natural that's processed quickly or fast would be chocolatey. A natural process that takes too long to dry will be moldy. And then you get all sorts of in-betweens. So chocolatey, to berry-like, to winey, to sour, to moldy. And even the sour can be, it possibly could be good, not necessarily bad. It depends on the coffee. 14 to 20 days. You don't want to really go more than 20 days. If you can dry less than 20 days, you're doing good. If you're going over 20 days, then chances are you're taking too long and you're going to get moldy. If you do the whole drying process in a short amount of time, you're going to get a more chocolatey flavor, nutty, maybe something like that. If you take a really long time for the whole process, you're going to get a moldy flavor. I know Brazil has, their climate is much hotter and warmer, but I also know they do a lot of mechanical drying. So, in fact, it's my understanding that most of Brazil's natural coffees are all mechanically dried, especially with naturals, because a mechanically dried natural is going to dry relatively fast, which will be your more chocolatey flavor. A sun-dried natural will end up more on this side, berry, winey, sour. Sending it through a machine that's drying your coffee, you're going to dry it much faster than if you were drying it by the sun. I don't know of a drying method that is commonly used other than the sun, or like a wind tunnel, or a sun, like plastic covered beds, or actual mechanical like drum dryers. I don't know of anybody that has a massive facility that has climate controlled and bringing their coffee in. I think it would be too expensive to do it that way. Not worth the effort. So all of this to say that flavor formation in naturals is very, 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 very complex. It's not something you just like, oh, I want to create naturals. There's a lot of different variables to it. There's a lot of different things happening. And you need to set together a plan. If you want to create a natural, you need to make a plan, write it down, say what you want to do with it, set your goals, do it, and then evaluate it and see if it worked. And if it didn't work, then you try something. Also, you must know that cuppers internationally throughout the world are all look at naturals differently. There's a lot of cuppers in the world that love naturals and will give naturals better scores than washed. And there's a lot of cuppers in the world that will do the opposite, that hate naturals and give naturals worse scores. So Even though we try to make cupping as professional as possible, it's still subjective to the people who are cupping. The younger guys in the industry, the guys who are coming out of the third wave of coffee, which is the new specialty coffee shops that are popping up, they all want to see naturals and love naturals. Yeah, if you don't tell a person that they're cupping a natural, but when they taste it, they're still going to taste the things that make it uniquely natural. And there's a lot of people in the world that are going to taste those things and give it a lower score, and other people that are going to taste it and give it a higher score based on whether naturals are extremely controversial within the cupping world, because different people view them, especially when it gets more into the winey and sour flavors. Then you'll find a lot of people in the West and America specifically that don't have the palate to enjoy those things. But you'll find cuppers in the East that have grown up eating sour things or different fermented foods, and they find the coffee very pleasant.
All right. Thank you guys for your time. Thank you for sitting patiently and listening.
Did you find that helpful? If you did, consider giving it a like or subscribing to our channel. While you're at it, why not check out our other videos or join our network at ecocommunity.org for more interesting and sustainable agriculture solutions. Network members can receive up to 10 free seed packets per year.